Hello again. Nice to see many of you already here. We're about to kick off our next session for RayHub, and RayHub is our dedicated space for learning and leading together here at ESTRO. Our topic now is Reirradiation, from challenges to solutions, and you're going to hear from Appelt Effelt first, Rasmus Bokrantz, and we have Jakob Ödén here who will be moderating the session. I'll also be on hand with a microphone, so feel free to ask questions, raise your hands, and we have a bit of engagement as well, so you'll have the QR code in a second to join in. So I'll hand over to Jakob first.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will moderate this session. It's nice to see so many people here. A lot of familiar faces. I think many of you were here last year when we were in Vienna, had a talk similar to this, but everyone was mostly focusing on the challenges. Today we're going to try to go from challenges to solutions for reirradiation planning. And for this we have two excellent speakers, as Roshin just mentioned. And we will try to engage you as well a bit. So we will start off with I meant to meet a question just to see a few interaction from the audience. So the question here is then, what is the current biggest hurdle for clinical use of reirradiation? So please scan the QR code. You have 5 different options, just to give us a kick-off start of this talk. Now we see some answers. Lack of clinical data is in the lead, apparently. Seems quite evenly distributed so far. Give it a few more seconds. At least it seems like we hit some of the hurdles, since others 0 votes so far, so that's nice to see. But lack of clinical data seems to be the winning, and then there is also workload for competition and insufficient software tools. And I think this is a quite good start to move on to your presentation. So,
thank you so much. Okay, we're on. Let's move on. So, hello everybody. Great to see so many people. As was mentioned, I am Professor of Medical Physics and Clinical Medical Physics at Rigshospitalet in Copenhagen. I should note, however, that before I moved to Copenhagen, I worked in Leeds, and Leeds Teaching Hospitals does have a research collaboration agreement with RaySearch, so some of what you'll see today was developed as a partnership between us. So that's my disclosures done with. And then let's think about what is it that we see with these reirradiation patients. Because if we think about a classical patient trajectory, as we might have seen it, 10, 20 years ago, it would have looked something like this. The patient would get a cancer diagnosis, they would get some sort of treatment, which likely would include radiotherapy for at least half of our patients. They'd be followed, and they might unfortunately experience recurrence. And at that point, they would classically get 1 or more lines for systemic treatment. So this is what we thought if we think a few decades back. However, today, what we often see is that same patients, after their diagnosis, after their treatment, which might include radiotherapy, they get followed, and it's not unusual for us to see a localized recurrence, often an oligometastatic disease stage. And in that case, they might get 1 or more lines of local treatment, including radiotherapy, maybe also some systemic treatment. And if we keep them alive long enough, we might even end up with a new primary cancer, which will also require local treatment. And so for each of these treatments, we're going to have some sort of associated imaging, radiotherapy treatment plan, and so on. And each of these subsequent treatments must take that previous treatment into account. And you can already quickly see how complex this becomes, as any of you who are clinically dealing with reirradiations will be very aware. And we can ask why we see more patients like this. And it's a complex question. Patients live longer. We've got more and more awareness of oligometastatic disease as a stage, which can be managed separately. We are just better at delivering radiotherapy, more conformal, highly precise treatments. And then we do have growing experience and comfort with delivering reirradiation. So all of this contributes to rising patient numbers. And I'm not just saying that sort of anecdotally. We actually have numbers to back this up. We did a big audit across all Danish radiotherapy centers a few years ago, and we were able to demonstrate that in 2023, out of all of our patients, 16% were repeat customers, so to say. They were coming back for 1 or more courses of radiotherapy. And out of our curatively treated patients, 8%, so that's 1 in 12, were proper reirradiation patients. That's a massive number of patients. That makes it one of our biggest patient groups in the radiotherapy department. So we need to be able to deal with these. But again, as many of you are aware, these patients also add all sorts of added complexities to the radiotherapy workflow, right? All the way from referral and all the way through planning, plan evaluation, and delivery. And so each of these steps will potentially take up resources and potentially require dedicated tools. Now, for the sake of my talk, I'm just going to focus on this aspect here of the image registration, of the planning and the plan evaluation, which is in itself a highly complex field. And so we know that we have a need for tools to actually support even just this limited step of the radiotherapy workflow for reirradiation patients, because we did a big priority setting exercise a few years ago where we got 42 technical reirradiation experts to vote, to formulate and vote on what are the biggest limitations and what software tools are highest needed to support better reirradiation. And the highest scoring request was the ability to calculate and visualize 3D dose distribution using equi-effective dose. So this is one of the main barriers, or at least it was a couple of years ago. So let's try and see what that means. What is it that we need? So we got one of these patient cases here. So this patient received chemoradiotherapy for head and neck cancer, and then came back and received more chemoradiotherapy also to the head and neck region. And in this case, when we want to try and evaluate the cumulative doses for a patient like this, we end up having to deal with anatomical changes, fraction size effect, tissue recovery, complex issues. And especially the anatomical changes can be really hard to deal with, right? Because this is just an example of what we might see in the head and neck region with significant changes in the anatomy. And so the way that people have sort of traditionally, historically managed this in clinics has been through a variety of approaches, going from less to more complex approaches. With the more complex approaches all utilizing some sort of image registration. And we know from international exercises that we've done that in order to get more consistent results between centers in terms of the estimated cumulative dose, we need to go, I keep trying to put on the pointer, but that doesn't work, but we need to go for these image registration-based approaches. So this is what we really want, and this is what people are asking for, as we saw before. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like doing something like this with the image registration of our two sets of treatment images, preferably with deformable image registration. We know, again, from quite a bit of multi-center studies that we get more consistent results between centers if we use deformable versus rigid registration. So that will give us a deformation vector field. We can then take the deformation vector field, apply it to the previous dose distribution, and map it onto our new anatomy at the second course. And that means that we've now got the dose distribution defined on the same anatomy. But we can't quite sum the doses yet, because we also have to account for those radiobiological effects that I alluded to before. We have to account for the fractionation schemes for the two treatment and the per voxel changes in dose per fraction. So we need to calculate some sort of equi-effective dose measure, EQD2 or BED, before we sum the doses. But if we can do that, we can now go on and get a combined sum. And as I said, this is really what we ought to aim for if we want to get useful, consistent assessment of cumulative dose between centers. So that's lovely. That's great if we can get that far. But it's almost going a step too far, because here we've already got the phase 2 or the second course plan, and optimally that plan should have taken the previous dose into account up front. And so that is where things get really complex and also really cumbersome clinically, right? Because again, people have worked all sorts of clinical solutions, working within the confines of our standard treatment planning systems to achieve this, going from less complex to more complex approaches. What we will see clinically is most people are using either isodose volume for planning avoidance or some sort of max dose readout to calculate a new treatment dose constraints for your organs at risk in the new treatment. But these approaches, they are cumbersome. They require often a lot of manual dose calculation and estimation and back of the envelope estimations. And they're not very good at taking the spatial dose distributions into account. and they don't allow you to account for volumetric dose constraints. So they have a lot of limitations. What we really want, and now we're coming back to my priority setting exercise from before, is to be able to optimize using our cumulative dose. So this was the second highest request in this priority setting exercise. And so basically we want to optimize using the previous dose at some sort of background dose, so that when we optimize here, our new dose distribution is optimized with optimization functions that takes that cumulative equi-effective dose into account. And so we iteratively optimize our re-radiation plan in physical dose space, but the optimization functions are evaluated on the cumulative EQD2 dose. That's the goal we would like to see. And as you will see in a minute, this is now what we work with RaySearch on implementing in RayStation, which I'm super excited about. So we'll hear much more about this solution in a minute. I just want to mention that we evaluated this approach in pelvis, lung, head and neck, and brain in planning studies there. And sort of in summary, I put all the references down there. We find we can get increased target coverage with a proper background dose optimization approach. When we do blinded evaluation of plans comparing manual versus fully optimized approach, we get more clinically preferred plan for our clinicians. It's easier, it's more straightforward to plan, and we can actually get plans that are robust to our dose mapping uncertainties as well, which is really neat. Now, the final step here, which I'm quite excited about, is actually a presentation this afternoon, is that we've now also evaluated this in a multi-center setting and seen that we can get consistent planning results, which is quite something in a re-radiation setting when we are using this approach. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up. These are all of the people in Leeds that we worked with, plus all of the collaborators and people from RaySearch we collaborated with, and thank you so much.
Thank you for this very, very comprehensive, in a condensed way, focusing on the Reirradiation settings. So now I'll leave over to Rasmus, who will present some of the solutions for these challenges that Aine just mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I will basically focus in this presentation on what functionality for Reirradiation that will be supported in upcoming releases of RayStation. And this functionality is essentially designed to support the recommendations that are now available in the literature that were quite recently published. So the flow chart here to the right is from a study by the Reirradiation Collaborative Group, where, just as Aine explained, there is a clear recommendation to assess Reirradiation treatment plans in terms of equi-effective dose summed across the treatment courses using image registration, if that is possible. If not possible, for instance, because the image registration isn't sufficiently reliable, then the recommendation is to fall back on a point dose evaluation technique. So these are guidelines from one publication, and there's another related publication also that was recently published from the ESTRO focus group that provides quite a similar workflow. So, I mean, our functionality is very much intended as a streamlined workflow for the first method. It does also support the fallback method, but I will focus less on that in this presentation, and that also at this point in time requires some additional manual steps. But what I'll in this presentation essentially do is to walk through the RayStation modules that we envision will be used in Reirradiation treatment planning. So where you would typically start is in patient data management, where you would need to access the image data from about the prior treatment into the Reirradiation case. And this is needed because in RayStation, data that is associated to a single diagnosis should preferably be stored in a designated case. So you would start off by accessing the previous treatment in a different case. And this prior treatment that you take into account could, of course, be a plan generated in RayStation, but it could also be an imported treatment plan from another treatment planning system, or even just a dose distribution that doesn't have an explicit association with a treatment plan. Already today, we support access of image data in between cases to make them available for image registration, and it's also supported to associate RIs in between these cases. So with that in place, one can then move on to generate an image registration for dose accumulation, and the rigid registration that we see here to the left, that would in many cases be insufficient to capture the anatomical variations that we see in reirradiation. So the coming version of RayStation will require that deformable registration must be used, and this registration can be generated using either of the two existing algorithms in RayStation, the intensity and structural information based on a Conda algorithm, and also the biomechanical Morpheus algorithm. And the Anaconda algorithm has also quite recently been adapted to perform better on these type of anatomical variations that are typical for reirradiation. But then the next step would be to generate a reirradiation treatment plan. And I mean, the starting point of that could be any standard treatment plan in RayStation generated using any of the existing techniques that we have for plan generation. So you could really start off with just a standard treatment plan and then turn it into a reirradiation treatment plan by explicitly associating this plan with the prior treatment. And this is done in a new section in the edit plan dialog, where you open up a dialog for selection of the prior treatment in the other case, and it also displays some information about this selected prior treatment. So now we have these treatments linked, and we're ready to set up parameters for the equi-effective dose computation. And there you specify alpha-beta ratios on a ROI level to model fractionation sensitivity. We also support tissue recovery factors that allows us to disregard a fraction of the previously delivered dose to account for recovery. And then based on these parameters, the system will compute one unique dose distribution for every combination of parameters that occur for some RI. And these parameter-specific distributions, as we call them, they are used for all RI-based dose reporting, such as DVH curves, statistics, clinical goals, optimization functions. And this is actually quite important to avoid inaccuracies that would otherwise arise at the interface between structures that have different parameters, where you can have voxels that belong to multiple structures because they are right at the intersection in between two RIs. In 2D, we superimpose these distributions just for display purposes, and that is controlled by drag and drop of these parameters that can be changed in real time. So, having specified these parameters, the system will automatically propagate this prior dose on the original image to the reirradiation planning image, convert the mapped dose to equi-effective dose. Then it will take the equi-effective dose of the new reirradiation, and finally, of course, sum the distributions across the two treatment courses. So that gives us cumulative equi-effective dose that is available for plan assessment in the plan evaluation module. So here one could, for instance, compare cumulative equi-effective dose with recovery, here shown on top, against cumulative dose without any assumed recovery, which will provide some differences, of course, within the organs where some recovery is assumed. And this module also contains the cumulative physical distributions as well as the prior distributions mapped to the new planning image. One can also look at clinical goals that will be able to evaluate with respect to the cumulative dose. And these, any type of clinical goal can now be configured to either act on physical dose or RB dose for ions, or EQD2, or even EQD2 accounting for tissue recovery. And in plan evaluation, we also support EQD2 for many types of evaluation doses, such as deformed, perturbed, and some doses. And this makes it possible to evaluate the robustness of the cumulative equi-effective dose, for instance, in terms of geometric errors applied to the reirradiation treatment plan. And finally, as Ane already explained in her presentation, it is also possible to actually take the cumulative dose into account at the generation of the Reirradiation plan. So you can have optimization functions acting on the cumulative eco-effective dose with or without recovery. And that would be, of course, appropriate for the organs at risk. And then you can have simultaneously functions acting on the physical plan dose, for instance, for the target volumes. We also apply an adaptation of the dose level specified to the user for dose limiting functions. In the case that the user has specified a value below the dose that's already present from the background irradiation. We have a technical note explaining the details of that principle. And finally, I just want to highlight that robust optimization is also supported for these new types of functions. So this will be a first release. It will come with some limitations. I just want to be transparent about that also. So more long term, we plan to extend this to also plans with multiple beam sets, plans with multiple prior treatments, also support reirradiation for adapted plans, and have visualization of EQD2 in the plan optimization module. And again, please come to the presentation at 5 p.m. To get more insight about the validation of this functionality across 3 centers in the UK. We also have a digital poster on the dose modeling framework for EQD2. And please also book a demo if you want a more in-depth walkthrough of this functionality. And finally, I want to acknowledge our clinical partners on this topic in Leeds, Manchester, Newcastle, that have been very important for this development. And thank you also for your attention.
Thank you, Rasmus. We have a couple of minutes of discussions here. But again, you just want to engage you again. So now you have been 20 minutes of listening. So please scan the QR code if you have it open already. It's the same one that you had before. And the question now is that after this presentation, how would you feel? Would you feel confident to make a clinical decision based on the cumulative EQD2 if you have it in 3 dimensions? It's lagging a bit behind, but it seems like yes is confidently. No is actually getting 0 answers. So selective cases, of course, it depends on how you interpret the word various selected cases here, but of course, it seems like people are quite eager to use this cumulative dose. So how does this for you and match with that people still say that they lack clinical data? How should we use this cumulative dose if we lack the clinical data? How should it actually be done in reality? What's your take on this?
I mean, I think the reality is that we are getting these patients and we are treating them. And more information for the individual patient assessment can only be good. And that's, I mean, we did some work way back where we're talking 5-6 years ago, where we sort of presented some clinicians with the option of just looking at, the dose distribution separately, looking at a rigid rigidly matched dose distribution, deformably matched dose distribution, or the same in EQD2. And it was very clear that the clinicians thought that they got more clinical information, useful information out of looking at the EQD2. So it's not whether you get perfect, confidence in your decision making. It's whether it's better than not having that information available, I think. And I think that matters irrespectively of whether we know exactly what the right dose limit is. Like knowing that my brachial plexus got 80 plus gray is probably useful irrespective of whether I know the tissue recovery for the brachial plexus, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree. It seems like people also agree with you. Since all 10 actually answer that they're going to use it, even though, of course, it could be a selective case. And I imagine that the deformation could be an issue in some cases. The use of tissue recovery factors could be used in these cases. And the potentially also the alpha-beta values for the EQD2. So what are your takes on this? How do you think you should use the tissue recovery, for example, and which kind of alpha-beta values should be used? And if you don't trust the deformation for certain organs, how do you think you should tackle this in the clinical reality? I mean, it's a huge question.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't matter. You're asking like 5 different questions at once. Kind of a little bit unfair. I think that my very, very high-level answer to all questions is at least be consistent. So make sure that it doesn't come down to the individual physicist or the individual clinicians sitting with this dealing with the individual patient case. And I think this partly why we see this ask for better software is because it supports consistency across a clinic. It's going from doing almost like hand-based dose calculation to actually having consistent dose planning system. So when it comes to things like do you use tissue recovery factors or not, make sure you at least have, or which alpha beta value you use, make sure there's at least some sort of institutional protocol and that it's documented. I think that's my approach to it. And then there is, you can look at the robustness of your decision making relative to whether you have, one value or another of these parameters. And again, that's where I think more automated systems makes it a lot easier to evaluate 5 different alpha beta values rather than having to do a hand-based calculation for each of them.
I agree. Rasmus, can you give us some insight to how this could be used in RayStation? How can you model the uncertainty in the alpha beta parameters, and how do you handle the tissue recovery for evaluation, for example? How is this built in?
What we have in place is that all of these parameters are specified on a plan level, so you can copy the actual plan that you intend to use for treatment and apply different parameter values using a copy of this plan to really study how robust your planned treatment is against different selection of parameters, and that would be really encouraged, of course, to do that.
Yes, and also to highlight, even if you're using a tissue recovery, you will always see the dose in EQD2 without the recovery, so you will always have the distribution together. So even if you're uncertain about the recovery, you can still visualize the dose and the clinical goals and everything without it. And before we finish it off, we have one last Mentimeter question for you, and this is also very similar to the presentation that you saw that we finish off with optimization. So if you had the tools, would you optimize directly on this cumulative EQD2 in reirradiation cases if you had it today in clinical practice? And it's yes, no, or only in selective cases as before. Some fast yes answers.
Yeah, good to see.
I was expecting a few of these, at least in the only in selective cases. And perhaps a bit no, because this, I know that this has been...
Oh, we got to know.
We got to know.
That's good.
Now we have a discussion.
Yeah.
No, but I know that this has been discovered, and you have highlighted this in your presentation. So can you please comment this? Why should you optimize on the cumulative EQD2, even though there are these uncertainties?
Because you should account for that previous spatial dose distribution, and obviously there are workarounds today that you can do it without optimize directly on the full EQD2, cumulative EQD2. You can create isodose structures from the previous plan and feed them in as optimization volumes in your new plan and so on. So I'm not saying that isn't a good approach and won't give you good plans. I don't think it'll give you better plans than doing it directly on the EQD2 dose distribution, and this is just a much smoother one step. So again, it's about having a sort of a consistent approach across all of your cases. I think that for me would be the argument to do it, that allows you to both take the spatial distribution into account and also sort of directly optimize on those cumulative clinical goals that you're going to evaluate your plan on.
Yeah, thank you. And Rasmus, can you comment something about, I mean, when you start off with this clinician, how should you start? I mean, what options do you have in RayStation that you can optimize with and without this cumulative EQD2, and how can you compare these?
Yeah. The main thing, I guess, is that it's still possible to not only optimize on cumulative EQD2. You can still have enter additional functions on the standard physical distribution per plan that you're used to. So I think it's very good to kind of introduce it gradually and have both types of functions simultaneously. And there can also again be functions both with and without recovery if you also want to be certain that you meet some those threshold levels, not dependent on the recovery that is assumed.
Yes, and I think it's also important to highlight what you also showed in the presentation, that you can just do a regular plan. You can just regular dose functions, whatever, and then just connect it to your prior treatment and do the evaluation in cumulative EQD2. And then you can, of course, copy this plan, do a cumulative optimization on EQD2, and then you can always compare this and see. I think this is probably the way how to get confident also in using this in optimization. So our time is up, but I think I do have some burning question from the audience, or otherwise you will probably find Ödén and Rasmus on this conference to talk more about reirradiation. So thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure to having you.
Yeah.